When Griffin exploded onto the League of Legends landscape, going from the challenger scene in Korea to becoming one of the most dominant and successful LCK teams in a single split, that was something that we have never seen before in all of League of Legends. The closest example that you could maybe draw a parallel between is the rise of Rox. Rox Tigers, Coup Tigers, they went through a number of different names, but back in 2015 is when they first got into the competitive scene in Korea, and they similarly went from being just a new team in the league to suddenly coming in second behind SKT a couple of times in the spring and summer splits, I believe. They might have, I think they've came in first in the spring split, but then lost in the finals, and then they fell off a little bit in the summer, but in the summer split, but they were still able to make Worlds and come in second behind SKT at Worlds. So they were still a very successful team themselves, but they had a little bit more of a slower rise. They had 2 full splits to play in LCK. They also weren't really bumming around a challenger scene or anything. That was the first year that LCK happened, when OGN Champions was taken over from Korea, or when OGN Champions was taken over by Riot and setting up their own LCK league in the Korean scene. So Rox was not a team that you saw, playing a lot of games. There wasn't a challenger scene for them to play, and I think there was just one event where it was like them and 3 other teams to determine who was going to end up qualifying for the LCK. And on top of that, they also had a spring preseason where they got a lot of practice against top teams. They got a lot of practice against SK Telecom and all the other top teams in Korea, and they didn't look that hot against them at first during that preseason. I think they ended like 5th or 4th or something. They ended middle of the pack, and it took a little while for them to rise to the level of success and dominance that they had for their short period of time that they were in League of Legends. If you compare that story to Griffin is actually even more explosive and impressive. Griffin went from winning the challenger scene and making promotion into LCK to nearly winning LCK in the first split that they were there. They had one split where they were a part of a 4-way tie for first, and then they ended up barely losing in the finals to KT Rolster in playoffs. They lost 3-2 in a best of 5, and if they had won that, think about this for a second. If they won that final game, they would have made it to Worlds on the first Korean seed. They would have kind of been there instead of KT Rolster, or they would have been in KT Rolster's spot. And if that happened, then they would have gone up against Invictus Gaming, assuming everything panned out the way it did. If they were able to beat Invictus Gaming, then they would be world champions. So it's a lot of little hoops to jump through and a lot of fun theoreticals you can play around with. But realistically, Griffin were possibly, they were very close to going from being in the challenger scene in the spring split to potentially winning Worlds if they just had a few Game 5s go their way. That is incredible. That is insanely impressive, and we have never seen anything like that before. There have been times where we've seen teams in challenger scenes come up and be successful in their own region. There have been times where maybe the closest parallel you could actually draw is between Griffin and Dignitas, back when Dignitas was originally rock solid in the North American scene, and then TSM and CLG, they were the only 2 competitive teams where then rock solid came out of nowhere and started winning a bunch of tournaments. I mean, that's maybe the closest comparison you could make, but to do it in Korea, in the LCK, and become, possibly the best team in the world, playing in the best region in the world, or, you could argue tied with China, but playing in the best region in the world, possibly becoming one of the best teams in the world in less than a year is insanely impressive and something that a lot of people are taking for granted. This is something that a lot of people, well, first they saw what happened with Griffin and they were very impressed, obviously, but then it got interesting when in the following LCK split, the promotion for this year's spring, Damwon and a team called Team Battle Comics that now renamed to Sandbox, they both beat MVP Blue, or just MVP, and Barbecue Olivers to make it into LCK. And then similarly, they were kind of like Griffin light, where they were mostly, almost completely comprised of rookies and young players who have either played on just like one other team or who haven't played in competitive league before. And similarly, they also had a lot of success as well. Between Griffin, Damwon, and Sandbox, there was a moment early, like halfway through the spring split this year, where the way the standings worked out was Griffin was in first, Sandbox was in second, SKT, who just created a super team in the offseason, was in third, and then Damwon was in fourth. And it was a really crazy, impressive thing that got a lot of people talking. A lot of people were looking at this and saying, okay, what's happening here? This is really impressive. This is really interesting. This is really exciting. But then they started thinking, maybe this is just turnover, right? I mean, maybe MVP, they were a team that's been around for a really long time in the Korean scene, and they didn't really have many players that were still on the team that had played for a long time. But, a lot of older organizations have kind of been struggling or filtering out of the Korean scene. Of course, CJ Entus, who was one of the most legendary Korean organizations, doesn't exist anymore. MVP is now relegated. I don't even know if they're in the challenger scene. I don't believe they are. And then more recently, we've seen the Samsung / Genji / everything they name themselves. They struggled a ton in the spring split and almost got relegated. And then KT Rolster and Jin Air, who are two of the staples of the Korean team, they were the last place teams that had to play through a relegation series, even though, KT, they had a very star-studded roster. They had Score and Smeb, who have been incredibly impressive and legendary players for such a long period of time. And to see them struggle, coupled with some of SKT's struggles throughout all of last year, and coupled with all of the older players that seem to either be struggling, not performing up to their previous standards, or retiring. Some players have either left Korea, like Gorilla has left Korea, and then Prey just retired recently. A lot of the old guard in Korea seems to be getting filtered out, and a lot of people kind of viewed the Damwon, Sandbox, and Griffin stories as, okay, maybe this is just what's happening now. Maybe all of the old players out there, they either can't keep up with the current strategies, current metas, they can't keep adapting with their age, or they're just straight up retiring like Prey did, and they're just not, there literally isn't anyone there anymore. So, it kind of makes sense. It's kind of natural to see a lot of newer players come up. You could even go back to Longzhu and their roster, where they had Khan, BDD, and Cuz, who were three players that were all very young rookies playing with Prey and Gorilla, and they were suddenly able to do super well, winning an LCK title. And similarly, you've seen a number of different players come up in the Korean scene recently, and a lot of people are just kind of saying that maybe this is just what's happening. All the old guard, it's their time to go. They've been around for too long, and eventually they're going to have to retire. And that's something that it was kind of the consensus for a little while, but more recently, we're kind of seeing that isn't the case. That's not happened. When KT Rolster and Jin Air went into relegations, even though they both looked pretty awful throughout the entire spring split, you could make some arguments that Jin Air and KT, they actually had some games where there were bright moments where they could be seen playing very well, which is why LS went on to say that if G2 was in LCK, then, Jin Air and KT are still better teams than G2. Which is, it's to say that even if these teams weren't performing super well, they still had a lot of talent on them. But even so, they did not perform well at all. I think Jin Air won one game, right? They won one game against Afrika, and then that's it. Like that's the only series that they were able to win throughout the entire spring split. And then KT similarly had really poor results, going 4-13 or something. And even with those horrible results, when they played through the challenger scene and faced relegations in the summer promotional tournament, they steamrolled their competition. I forget the two teams. One was ES Sharks, and then I think what was the other one, Byron Blade. I know APK Prince, or AKP Prince. They didn't make it. And it's kind of interesting because now when you look at this, I think it's kind of, the Griffin, Damwon, and Sandbox stories are getting a little bit more interesting because this wasn't just turnover. A lot of people did kind of view this as, again, just the old guard getting replaced by a lot of newer and younger faces, but that's not what's happened at all. Jin Air in particular is a team that's kind of been a mess throughout this entire past split, and they were still able to crush the challenger scene. One of the reasons that relegations and promotion was removed from a lot of the other regions, like in North America, is because like in North America, for instance, the LCK or LCS was just so far ahead of the challenger scene that you would never see teams promote into it. And then, of course, there were all the financial reasons with franchising as well. But just the incredible skill difference between the top league and the secondary league saw very few moments where any team would end up winning promotion, and it was still pretty much the same teams in the top league anyway. And in Korea, it's kind of been a little bit, there have been some stories of teams making their way up and succeeding, going all the way back to Rocks again, but that hasn't happened nearly as much as people are kind of expecting it to. And more recently, I think we're looking at the challenger scene and realizing that it is still very far below the top league in Korea. If you actually look at the teams in the challenger league as well, a lot of the players aren't the same mold that Griffin, Damwon, and Sandbox are. Most of the players, while Griffin, Damwon, and Sandbox were rostered with complete rookies and players who had maybe played on one other team or filled in as a sub for another team, but other than that, this was like their first real competitive team and their first real chance to show off a lot of skill. If you look at all the players on ES Sharks and APK Prince, who were the top two teams to finish in the spring season of the Challenger League, they were rostered with some really old players. I mean, Kakao and Mickey were on APK Prince. Those are like two of the oldest names that you'll see in League of Legends. Kakao has been he played on KT Rolster with like their original roster back when they were the Arrows and Bullets. Like he was on some of their oldest teams in like 2012. That's when that team formed, right? I mean, he has been around for a really long time in the scene. Same with Mickey, and even some of the other names that aren't as familiar. There's still a lot of players out there that have either been playing in the LCK or in the challenger scene, either on the LCK's lower teams or in the challenger scene for a while, or they've been playing around in other leagues. They've played in the Japanese league, the Turkish league, the Brazilian league, even a couple of them in the European LCS back when it was EU LCS. And all of this is kind of going to show that this isn't a circumstance where the challenger scene is filled with young talent that's just chomping at the bit to take over for any old player that can't keep up anymore in the Korean scene. The stories between Griffin, Damwon, and Sandbox is really interesting and really exciting because it is a much bigger achievement than what we're given credit for. Most of the players out there, there might still be some issues with some of the players. Smeb and KT Rolster and as well as Score, they did not play super well in this split. Some people have even been theorizing that maybe Score is going to end up retiring because he's been around the league scene for such a long period of time. But this isn't just an instance where the old guard is falling away because they can't keep up anymore. There are still elements of that, but there are still a lot of old players like Faker who are still performing incredibly well. And I think it's doing a bit of a disservice to some of the other younger players on Griffin and the other teams that have accomplished something that's really interesting, right? Like, this is a significant moment because this accomplishment is insane. They were still going up against all of these incredible players. They were still going up against these legendary players who have been playing very well and who still have a lot of talent with them. This is not just an instance of older players retiring and people filtering in and taking their spots. And it's interesting as well because this might be one of the last times that this happens. There was a news article that came out last week where people have been reporting that Riot is potentially considering franchising LCK. I think it said that they're looking to franchise LCK and they're looking for like a good opportune moment to franchise LCK, which if that happens, then of course these promotion relegation things these stories are going to disappear, right? There won't be. LCK is the only region in the world that still uses promotion relegation. Every other region has just a franchise system now. And if they end up getting, if they end up getting rid of promotion relegation in LCK, then we will no longer see stories like this. And if that's the case, then we should really give as much credit as we possibly can to Griffin in particular, but as well as Sandbox and Damwon, who have done something that, again, I don't know if you can make a comparison at any other point. There have been teams in Europe that have come up through the challenger scene and were able to succeed and do well in the top league. And there have been a couple of times throughout the history of North America where new teams were able to come up and suddenly start beating the best out there, even with very little practice and experience beforehand. But it's It's incredible. It's an incredible and shocking thing to see that happen, and not to just see it happen, but to see it happen in the best region in the world, in one of the toughest leagues that you can possibly play in, to see complete rookies. Not even like, Longzhu is another instance where this kind of happened, where you had 3 rookies in Khan, Cuz, and BDD playing with old veterans, Prey and Gorilla, but they still had some really talented old veterans. Prey and Gorilla they're one of the best AD carries and supports respectively of all time in League of Legends. So there was still quite a bit of veteran attitude that they could lean on if they were ever lost, right? That was not a complete set of completely fresh faces like you see with these newer teams. And it is incredible what this accomplishment has been. And we should really appreciate it, particularly if this is the last time we're going to see it, because there's likely not going to be another thing that happens like this in the immediate future. If you pay attention to what's happening in the challenger scene in Korea, this likely isn't going to happen again for a while. And if it takes too long, and if Riot does end up franchising LCK, then there's a good chance that this might be the last time it ever happens. So that's something that I hope people pay a little bit more attention to. And I might end up giving my thoughts on the potential franchising of LCK in another video. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed watching this video. I will see you all in the next one. But until then, thank you very much for watching. Good luck in solo queue, and have a wonderful day.